So this was one of those off-the-grid cabin, middle of nowhere, bring a few kegs and everyone you know and let's get wrecked situations. It was even more secluded because this was my friend's property, and he owns about 9 square miles of untouched land near Ward, CO. We are, or should be, the only human beings for miles. There's probably a couple of dozen of us, and this is in mid-November if memory serves. The original plan was to camp in tents around a bonfire, but it pretty quickly became more of a blizzard situation with low visibility, high winds and frostbite levels of cold. This leaves us crammed into a maybe 600 square foot cabin to get fucked up and pass out in a pile. No sweat, we're all friends here. Sometime in the middle of the night, everyone's quieting down and I need a cigarette and to pee. I stumble, pretty wastedly, into my coat and boots and throw on several hats. I go outside, the wind has slowed a bit, and the moonlight makes everything coated in ice and snow shine like diamonds. I light my smoke and walk maybe 20 feet into the woods to pee, something every Colorado kid knows by heart as the frostbite wind chill chart, and the fact that in this weather flesh freezes in 25 minutes is hard to forget when your Johnson's out. Midstream though, I hear something or someone another 20 or 30 feet out into the woods. Though it sounds like a human voice, the wind makes it hard to hear, and the snow and the dark make it impossible to see. I manage to wiggle my smoke to the corner of my mouth and muster up my best mountain man voice to yell, "Anyone there?" Still pissing a river. It takes not even a second for me to hear a reply. "Over here," in a voice that sounds exactly like my best friend, the kid who owns the cabin. "You okay, Jay?" I call out. Nothing. So I zip up and go to trudge further out and make sure he's alright. Just as I'm stubbing out my smoke though, I hear my name called much louder and clearer from the cabin. I yell back that I'm okay and head back to the cabin with a curiosity glance behind me. And who's waiting at the door but the very kid that I could have sworn that I heard in the woods. I told him I heard something, and he just told me that I was drunk, but he trusted me enough to humor me by helping me with a head count. Nobody missing. I tried to forget the whole thing, but I was very glad to be sleeping well armed and in good company that night. But I wonder, what would I have found if I had headed further out?
Number 8.
To give you a bit of background, I live in an alleyway where 4 cottages are located, and we have really nice neighbours. I'm 16, and I live at cottage number 1 with my mum and my cat. So about a month ago, someone had bought cottage number 3, and I was thinking that this house had been for sale for a few months now, so it was good for someone to buy it. I was actually really excited about the prospect of a new neighbour moving in. When the new neighbour, Claire, came to introduce herself, my mum was very pleased to see that someone had actually bought the house and took the time to introduce herself. I just smiled at her as I was playing on my computer, but something seemed off about her. She wore glasses, brown longish hair, looked around early 30s and talked really fast. She said goodbye and went back to her house, and I carried on playing my computer game. About a week later, she came around again, but not to say hi, but to ask what time our local pub closed. It was about 10:30 at night, and we were planning to go to bed soon. My mum shook her head when she asked what time the pub closed, and said, I have no idea, sorry," and began to shut the door. Claire then pushed against my mum's force and said, "Are you sure? You've lived here for some years, right?" And my mum replied, "Yes we have, and we're planning on going to bed. Could you please leave?" Claire replied, "Of course, have a good night." That night, I was listening to music on my iPad as I couldn't sleep. I then heard a loud bang from next door, like a ladder or a bookshelf had just collapsed, and I got up out of bed and went downstairs to check, but heard nothing after. 2 nights had passed, and the person who lives next door worked night shifts as a policeman, and he guaranteed that nothing had fallen over and crashed onto the floor. I thought it was very strange, but decided to brush it off and leave it, but something was keeping it in my mind. About a week later, I just got home from school and started to chill out and watch TV when my phone rang. I examined my phone. Private number. So I answer and said, "Hello?" And a female voice replied, "I saw you come into your house, young man." My blood ran cold and I froze. I then replied, "Who the fuck is this?" And then the call ended. I thought maybe it was one of my friends trying to play a prank on me, but they wouldn't go that far. They aren't that cruel. It was about 10 p.m. when my phone rang a second time, still as a private number, and I picked up and shouted, "Whoever you are, stop fucking calling me!" And the same voice replied, "But I like calling you. You look so angry when you're shouting down the phone." And this is when I had enough and said, "Fuck off and stop fucking stalking me." And the voice did a faint growl and then hung up. That same night, around 3 a.m, I was awoken to the sound of someone banging on my front door. So me, being the stupid but tired 16-year-old that I am, I went down to open it. And what I saw next was absolutely terrifying. It was Claire, standing at my doorstep with a knife in her hand. She said, "No screaming now, we don't want anyone to hear you." At this point, my anxiety rose. I was frozen to the spot and had no clue what to do. She then slammed the door behind her and lunged at me with a knife. I darted out of the way just in time, and I sprinted into the kitchen to find a kitchen knife of my own. Just as I did, Claire burst through the door. At this point, my mum ran downstairs and screamed, "Claire, what are you doing?" Claire screamed as she ran towards my mum, her knife in a stabbing position, like she was going to stab my mum in the throat. I dropped my knife and jumped onto her back with all my strength and brought her tumbling to the floor with her on top of me. She had dropped her knife at this point, and I struggled to get out from under her. I eventually did and kept Claire down as she struggled to get her knife. My mum ran to grab her phone and dialed the police, and within 10 minutes, 2 police officers arrived. Claire at this point had stopped struggling and the police put her in handcuffs. One police officer had taken her away, while the other questioned my mum and I about what had happened. I told the police officer that she had moved in about a month ago, and then suddenly tonight she just wanted to kill me. The second police officer came back with a really horrified look on his face. He stuttered, and what he said will creep me out for the rest of my life. "Listen, Claire, that lady, she's an escaped prisoner from the local jail from 20 minutes from here." My mum and I looked at each other, just shocked and horrified. The police officer said that as he was taking her back to the police car, she actually said that she was very ill and was from the local jail and had escaped and wanted to kill any children or teenagers she saw. As he said this, my blood was like ice and I had a sinking feeling in my stomach. It's been 3 weeks as I'm writing this and I've had no weird calls from my phone, but I'm beginning to wonder now, how the fuck did she get my number?
Number 7.
So this story happened back when I was in 5th grade in 2005 when I lived in Western Montana. My bedroom was shared with my 2nd grade sister and we had a king-size bed that we shared. To describe my house a little, our room was facing the backyard that was a basement room. Basically, standing up and looking out the window in my room, I was eye level with the ground outside. Up to the left above my window, I could see onto our deck which looked into our upstairs kitchen. I know, kind of confusing, but bear with me. Anyways, this particular night, my sister and I were having a sleepover, and our friend was in the bed with us. When we were falling asleep around 1 a.m, our friend woke us up to show us that a deer was on our deck. We all looked out, and we all saw a deer on the deck. This was normal in Montana, so we laid back down. I guess my friend stayed up staring at it, and she woke us up about 5 minutes later, saying that she thought it was actually a person. Right then, we looked and we saw the shadow move a little, and it was clearly a tall person's silhouette. We started freaking out, and then we saw 2 green laser lights. They were just 2 small pinpoint lights that were coming from the guy's head area. We all thought that it was binoculars. At this point, we were all on high alert, and our eyes adjusted a little, and we saw it was clearly a guy looking into our kitchen window. I was too scared to go tell my parents all the way upstairs, and past the view of the guy looking into the window, so we used my friend's cell phone and called the home phone. It rang loudly and we watched the guy run full speed off of the deck. As soon as he ran away, the 3 of us ran screaming upstairs and told my dad. He called the cops and they searched the streets but never found the guy. Now, here's where things get weird. So just 2 weeks earlier, the town's police station sent around notices in our neighborhood telling us that a person of interest, and dangerous sexual predator who had a warrant for his arrest had been spotted in our area. A tip had said that he was staying with a family member 3 streets down from us. I remember this because I remember my mum, who was a bit paranoid, drove us by the address of the house on the notice one time and made us very aware that this was going on and would not let us ride our bikes outside during this time. I remember looking at the house every time we drove by. So it turns out, maybe 2 or 3 months later, this man was apprehended for the kidnappings and abuse and murders of 2 children and killing their family in Idaho, only 2-ish hours away from my house. In some of his interrogations, he confessed to stalking the kids by watching their homes at night with what? Night vision goggles. The same green lights we saw that night. I also one time found some obscure website that had some of his writings where he discussed living in Montana at various times and discussed that right before killing this family, he was searching for children to kidnap. We were the same ages as the kids that he kidnapped.
Number 6.
So I've been living with my parents for quite a while. My sister and I both moved back in shortly after I finished school, so there were 4 of us in the house. On some of my days off, it'll just be me alone in my house. My sister would be at work, parents would be out or at work too. I used to really love that sweet, sweet alone time. On one of these days when it's just me, 2 dogs and 3 cats alone in my little house, I was sitting in one of the 2 living rooms. There's an open floor plan for living room A and the kitchen dining room, and then a doorway leading into living room B. So I'm sitting alone playing a little Skyrim on my Xbox. 2 of my cats are in the room with me, the 3rd is upstairs, and the 2 dogs are asleep on the couch next to me. Everything's chill and I'm thinking about turning off my Xbox and taking a nap. And then I hear my sister's voice call out my name from living room B. I literally froze and didn't move for the longest time, just sitting and listening to see if the voice would speak again. But it didn't. It was specifically my sister's voice calling my name, speaking it as if she was searching for me. I can only figure that something mimicked her voice. My house is extremely old and I've had plenty of paranormal experiences here, but that was the first time that I'd ever experienced some entity walking one of my family members. The only other time this has happened was when I was walking up my stairs, passing my bedroom to get to the bathroom at the end of the hall. I pass my bedroom and look directly inside to see if my cats are in there, and I see my dad wearing a wife beater and just glaring. I passed by the room initially, but then it really registered in my head that my dad looked really pissed and was in my bedroom. So I looked back and there was nobody in my room.
Number 5.
This isn't my story, it's my dad's. My father used to have a business in maintaining the woods. There's no English term for it, it's a thing in my country. It basically means cutting down trees and hauling them out of the area. This meant that he was out in the woods all day, and he was allowed in places normal citizens couldn't come because of rules by the Forestry Commission. My dad was working in the early morning when he suddenly noticed a car in the middle of the woods. It drove through a small path, normally only used by the forester. It wasn't a car from the commission, so he thought it was very weird that it was there. However, Dad was alone and it was the 80s. No mobile phones to contact anyone. Since it was in the middle of nowhere, he decided to ignore it. He kept on hauling wood through the woods with his horse when he suddenly heard men speaking. Now, my dad is a brave man and strong as a bear, so he decided to just take a quick peek to see what the hell those folks were doing. My dad looked around for some thick brush, making sure that he couldn't be seen by the men. They were digging a hole. My father decided that this was something that he really didn't want to interrupt, and he kept working throughout the day like nothing ever happened. He made sure to keep some distance between him and the digging site. The men apparently never noticed my dad, possibly because his equipment wasn't located in the direction that the men came from, and my father worked with horses, so there weren't any loud machines. It was the 80s after all. At the end of the day, my father got to the local commission office and reported it, and they called the police. There was a body of a young woman buried there. It still irks my dad to this day. He was out there alone. What if the men saw him? Or what if he decided to check the burial ground out himself? Scary shit.
Number 4.
A couple of nights ago, my friends and I were enjoying a couple of beers at my house. My parents were gone for the night, and I took full advantage of it. I live in a suburb in Pennsylvania, and the neighborhood I lived in was always pretty quiet, except for a couple of house parties now and then. As my friends and I were drinking, playing beer pong and having a good time, we heard a tap at the window. We all turned and laughed, assuming that it was our friend Jeffrey trying to give us a good scare. When I got up and opened the curtains, there was nobody in sight. I was honestly pretty buzzed and just laughed at it, and all of my other friends did too, and we didn't think much of it. It was about 12 AM, and we were all pretty drunk. My friend Jeffrey bought more booze, and you can imagine where it went. As we were all being stupid, exchanging stories and doing typical drunk challenges, there was a loud scratching noise this time on the window which startled us all. My friend Charlie told me that he would go check it out. When he did, he opened the blinds and let out a horrifying scream, one that I would never forget. We all jumped and ran to where the curtains were to see what he was yelling about. When we looked outside the window, I could see 3 guys dressed up as clowns dancing around, pointing and laughing at us. We all freaked the fuck out and closed the curtains. Calling the cops was not an option because we're all underage and we didn't want to get pinched like that. Since it was my house, I decided to take matters into my own hands and went outside to try and confront these fuckers. When I went out, of course, I couldn't see them. Charlie and my other 4 friends came out and scoped the place out with me. Before we go back inside, one of my friends, Jason, let out a yell and an adamant, "Get off me, fucker!" When we turned around, we saw these clown guys who were hiding behind the shed of my house, holding Jason in a necklock and trying to drag him somewhere. In our drunk state, we all went after them and started punching the shit out of these clowns. They eventually let go of Jason, but one of them took out what seemed to be a machete and tried to swipe it at Jason while the others tried to run at us. As soon as they did that, we all bolted inside and locked all the windows and doors. I went up to my dad's office to get his Colt 45 and try to scare or even threaten these fuckers away. When I came back downstairs, all of my friends were scared shitless and Jason was literally crying. When I looked outside the window again, the clowns were gone. The next day, when we were all sober, I decided to call the cops and they proceeded to tell me that they found 3 guys dressed as clowns terrorizing a family just a couple of blocks away from my house. The police told me that one of the men did in fact have a machete, and the last house they hit where they got caught, the man cut a woman's arm, not to the point of amputation, but still a bad cut nonetheless. I get chills every night when I go to bed, thinking that one day they'll come back and finish the job. My friend Jason has honestly never been the same, and has since had to see a psychiatrist. All of my other friends still have nightmares of this too. We all just wish that this clown craze be put to an end and that these sick fucks get arrested for what they're doing.
Number 3.
This happened in the mid-90s. I was about 5 years old and my family decided to go on a trip to Fiji over spring break. My parents, aunts and uncles grew up there, so we weren't solely there as tourists. The first few days we stayed with relatives and got the local experience, which was a lot of fun, honestly. It was mine and my older brother's first time there. There was a big group of us visiting. Me, my brother, a handful of our cousins around the same age, and all of our parents. I was the youngest. After visiting relatives, the adults decided to rent a beachside house for the remainder of the trip. We were all really excited about the view and being so close to the beach. The house was really big too. To this day, it's the biggest and nicest house I've ever had the chance to stay in. Anyway, we swam, hiked, sat around a bonfire, and did all the usual outdoorsy stuff. The first night was so much fun, and it's so deeply ingrained in my memory. The second night, however, the adults decided to go out for a few hours and leave the older kids to take care of the younger kids. They weren't going to be long. They said that they would come back at 10 o'clock at the very latest, and the house had a security system installed. So no one was really worried about anything happening. Plus, it was the 90s. Being the oldest of the kids at 17, my brother was left in charge. We had 3 cousins with us, 2 boys, 11 and 15 years old respectively, and 1 girl, 15 years old. I was rooming with my female cousin, and the boys were rooming together, while the adults had their own private rooms. Anyway, us kids decided to go to the beach while the sun was still out, an hour or two max. We packed up our beach gear and took off. The house was still in view. We didn't stray too far away. We were basically just in the backyard. My female cousin, Joanna, didn't let me out of her sight. In fact, she stayed with me and built sandcastles the entire time. We took a bunch of pictures on her disposable camera, some of which are still tacked onto her fridge all these years later. We're still really close, and I look after her young daughter all the time. So, the older boys swam out and did their thing, while Joanna, Eric, and I stayed behind and played on the beach. Our plans of staying out for only a couple of hours soon turned into 3. It was only as the water became a little too aggressive that we decided to go back inside the house. Because my brother's an idiot, he forgot the key to the back door in his room, so we had to use the front door of the house, which required walking all the way around the gate and down the dirt road out front. We packed up our shit and took off, the 5 of us. It was pretty dark at this point. Eric was walking with us, while my brother brought up the rear and my older cousin Dean took the lead in front. We kept quiet while we were walking back, all of us tired from being out all day. Joanna and my brother exchanged a few words here and there. I was so tired, I had no idea what they were saying, and I didn't care. My only concern was sleep and Game Boy. It was only as Dean slowed to a halt in front of us that I realized that something was eerie. There was a man walking towards us from the other side of the dirt road. I was very young at the time, but I remember the look on this man's face very clearly. He was old, Caucasian, very tan, and adorned in typical male tourist attire, consisting of a tropical shirt, cargo shorts, sandals, and a straw hat. His clothes were straight out of a tropical getaway catalogue. There were other houses in the area being rented out by people, so we all just figured that he was in a neighbouring property, walking home or something. Even so, my brother cut in front of Joanna, Eric and I, just in case, and slowed at the same time that the man did. The man introduced himself as Eddie and said he was lost, looking for directions to the house that he was staying at. He appeared to be under the influence, kind of glassy-eyed and wobbly. He couldn't stand perfectly still. There was some swaying, and for some reason, his eyes went directly to Joanna. He would periodically look at her while my brother was giving him directions. It was around this time that Joanna, who had been holding my hand, squeezed my tiny fingers inside her slightly bigger ones. I could tell she was nervous. Even then, at 5 years old, I sensed that there was something seriously wrong with the way this man was looking at her. Eric, who, up until that point, had ignored me the whole trip because he wanted to look cool in front of the older boys, took my other hand, and the 3 of us stood together like a shaky wall behind Dean and my brother. I couldn't really hear the words that were being exchanged. I just saw my brother gesturing as he was giving directions, pointing his arm back to the left and whatnot. This lasted about 5 minutes before we were on our way. My brother made sure to walk beside Eddie for a minute, all the way past our shaky wall, and then we waved by and we all carried on to our house. The older kids exchanged a look with each other, but didn't say anything. In fact, we didn't speak of Eddie at all. We entered the house, showered, and met in the kitchen for something to eat. My brother cooked for us and we sat around the table, talking about how much fun the beach was. And then we heard a knock on the front door. Expecting our parents, we didn't really think anything of it. The older kids were too lazy to get up and answer it, but Dean eventually caved. He went to the door, and I, being a curious 5-year-old, went with him. There were windows and a peephole on the door where Dean could have looked, but he didn't. He unlocked the door and opened it, his body language turning rigid as he met eyes with Eddie. Within seconds, Dean was on the defense, and he glanced back, motioning for me to go away and grab my brother. I waited for a couple of seconds before doing it, catching Eddie as he asked Dean if he could use the phone in the house. Apparently, he was too far away and the long walk was killing his legs, so he wanted to call a cab. This was before the age of everyone and their mother having a cell phone, so showing up on someone's doorstep asking to use their phone wasn't terribly out of the ordinary. I skidded off to the kitchen and motioned for my brother to follow me. I guess he saw the mildly anxious look in my eyes, so he immediately dropped his food onto his plate and went to the door. Like Dean, his body went rigid when he saw Eddie. The 3 of them spoke at the door for a long time. Eddie was begging to use the phone while Dean and my brother said that they couldn't let him inside. They said if he really wanted to use it, he should wait until the adults come home and ask them instead. By telling him this, however, they had let slip the fact that us kids were home alone. They must have been going at it for at least 10 minutes. By this time, Joanna came out to see what was happening. I remember she rocked back when she saw Eddie at the door, breath catching in her chest. She glanced down at me and nodded for me to join Eric in the kitchen. I usually wouldn't have listened, but that night I did. I went back to the kitchen and told Eric what was going on at the door. Even though he was older than me, he used to get scared really easily. To this day, he's still very jumpy when it comes to horror movies and things. For this reason, he swallowed the dry lump in his throat and yanked me back when I took off to see what was going on. Sometime later, Joanna and Dean returned to the kitchen without my brother. I raced past them, poking my head around the corner to see that my brother had let Eddie inside the house, standing with him as he used the phone. It was attached to the wall in the long hallway. My brother leaned against the wall and kept his attention firmly on Eddie as the man dialed the number for the cab company and called one to our address. This took about a minute, after which Eddie thanked my brother and waved bye to me on his way out. My brother kept the door open after that, standing there, watching for a solid 20 or so minutes until the cab arrived and drove Eddie away in the back seat. As per my brother's request, we decided not to tell our parents about Eddie. If they knew that we let a stranger inside to use the phone, they would have blown their shit. Rightfully, but still, we were kids and my brother tried to sort the situation out as best as he could. Plus, Eddie didn't really do anything per se. There was just something about him that was odd. The rest of the night went by without a hitch. In fact, 2 nights went by without anything weird happening. By this point, we had all forgotten about Eddie. Well, at least I had. Joanna, on the other hand, kept a huge kitchen knife in her room, just in case. I had no idea at the time. She told me this years later. On the 4th night at this house, the adults cracked open the barbecue outside and we had a little cookout in the back. There was good food, cold drinks, a deadly game of Monopoly, and even a little bit of storytelling from my uncle, aka Dean and Eric's father. My parents told me that I could stay up late with everyone, which I hadn't been allowed to do the entire time we were there thus far. Suffice to say that we were all having a good night. The stars were out, the waves were crashing softly on the shore, and the mosquitoes were biting the fuck out of us. My mother went inside to grab some repellent and didn't return until a couple of minutes later. She went straight to my father after, without the insect repellent, and whispered something to him, a wary look on her face. The others noticed, eventually asking what was going on. She told them some strange man was at the front door, knocking repeatedly. My father and sober uncle, Joanna's father, went over to check what all the fuss was about. They answered the door and asked Eddie what he wanted, who, to my memory, kept saying,
"My buddy Will said I could swing by. Can I talk to my buddy?"
Will is my brother's name. I remember thinking it was weird, the fact that he kept referring to my brother as his buddy. The adults found it very weird too. My father asked Eddie what he wanted and why he wanted to talk to my brother. Eddie just kept saying that Will was his buddy and that he wanted to see him. He was very clearly on something. Drugs, alcohol, I don't know. But there was something wrong with him. Eventually Eddie said that he needed to use the phone again and that Will had let him use it the last time. The jig was up. My father glanced back at Will as he came to see what was going on and gave him the death look. The "boy, you've done fucked up" look. He knew better than to let strangers into the house. But that was the thing. Eddie had a way about him. He was odd, but at the same time kind of disarming. You didn't know whether you wanted to knock him out or help him out. My father and uncle told Eddie that he couldn't use the phone, but they did give him directions to the nearest convenience store where he could ask for directions, find proper help, etc. Eddie tried to persuade them into letting him use our phone, but they firmly told him that he had to leave, shutting the door in his face immediately after. Sometime later, we all went to bed. Joanna and I stayed up a little later and she read me a chapter out of the YA novel she had been reading the whole trip. It was Flowers in the Attic, in case you're curious. Certainly not the most appropriate novel for a child of 5, but I had no idea what half of it meant anyway. In any case, I fell asleep, and a few hours later, I woke up to the sound of Joanna's voice. She shook me awake and said that we had to hide in the bathroom for a bit, The look in her eyes was wide and full of fear, and without her telling me directly, I knew that this was about Eddie. She took me by the hand and we locked ourselves in the bathroom. I noticed that she kept touching the back pocket of her jeans, but I didn't know why. I later found out that she had tucked the knife in there and felt for it every few seconds to make sure that she still had it. We hid for about an hour until we heard the police. I remember hearing their loud footsteps in the house, and I remember Joanna opening the door for them when they knocked on the bathroom to see where we were. I didn't know it then, but apparently Eddie had come into the house again while we were sleeping. The boys' room was really warm that night, so the three of them had left the window open. Apparently Eddie hovered by the window a second and quietly climbed inside. Eric, the poor thing, was the first one who saw him and screamed bloody murder, waking up Dean and my brother. Eddie's eyes were bloodshot and he was twitching all over the place, climbing in and asking his buddy to help him find the sweet girl from the other night. He was referring to Joanna. Every screw in his head was loose, and he began laughing, shouting and telling my brother that they could take turns on her, amongst other obscene things, all at the same time. It's like he couldn't decide if he was horny or angry. According to my brother and everyone else who restrained and held Eddie down that night, there was something incredibly off about him other than the fact that he had broken into the house. The way he was talking, he was so delusional, as though he was fully convinced that Will was really his buddy and that Joanna was really going to be his that night. To this day, my brother doesn't talk about it. He's the only one who refuses to recount his full version of the story. I think it has something to do with Eddie really truly thinking that they were all buds who had promised each other that they would use Joanna like a rag doll. This man was so fucking convinced. Anyway, their screaming woke up the adults and my mother called the police right away, while my father and my two uncles held Eddie down until the cops got there. Joanna's mother raced upstairs and woke Joanna up, telling her to grab me and hide until further notice. We had no idea if Eddie had come alone, but we were pretty convinced. My mother checked if the other windows and doors were closed and locked, and then she took Eric upstairs and waited with him in the hallway, trying to calm him down while the cops drove up. It turns out that Eddie had some mental problems. He had become obsessed with Joanna after he first saw her. She was exactly his type, young, of colour, and unwilling. Oh, and we later found out that Joanna wasn't the only girl that he had harassed on his trip, but she was the only one whose house he had snuck into in search of her. Who knows what would have happened if he climbed through our window instead of the boys.
Number 2.
I am pretty sure that we've all seen the recent string of events regarding these stupid clowns that seem to get a rise out of being straight up creepy. I never thought something like this would happen to me, and to be quite honest with you, half of it is my own drunken fault. But these clowns, the real ones, are nothing to play around with. This past weekend, me and my cousin and some of her friends decided to bring in one of our favourite months and our school's recent win in football by going to the local club after the game. Now, I go to school in a very small and poor town. This club is the only one around for miles and it's in the middle of a large field. Grass surrounds the building for miles, but it's usually covered with police cars, as I'm pretty sure working for the police in some way accounts for half the jobs in this town. I have to stress the fact that this town is not very big. A few people stretched arm to arm would make up this town. It's so small on the map that it would take you a hop, skip and a jump to pass through it without even recognizing it. So after downing some shots and getting dressed up in the skimpiest way a broke college student could do, we head out to the club. Standing outside gave me an eerie feeling this night. There was also only one police officer checking IDs, and one bouncer putting X's on those under the age of 21's hands, and no one was standing around outside the doors. There was just a line to get in. I've been to this club before. It's usually a mess of people trying to get in and out, and even climbing through windows. But this story isn't coming from my experience in the club. That's boring and full of people bumping into me, people kissing each other, and frequent trips to the bathroom to pee. Now, it's important at this time to tell you a bit about me. I'm a 6-foot-tall female, been drinking since I was 16. I wear glasses, and I can hold my liquor pretty well. It was about 2:10 a.m. I always leave the club about this time before the massive rush of people start heading for the door, because this club closed at 2:30 depending on the last person's requests, and I hate being caught in that mob. I stood outside the doors, waiting for the cool air to snap me into a sober enough state to take the keys that I had been entrusted with, and head back to my cousin's car to wait in the back seat. I have to note at this time that there was no one outside. Not the usual cop cars on the side of the road to catch drunk drivers or speeding college students. No one was patrolling. I couldn't sense a single soul around for miles. And that's when I saw it. One clown. He had to be 6 foot, maybe 6'1". The triangles on his eyes were painted black lipstick. His suit was yellow with red and blue buttons. He had the bold cap on with that fake red hair wig thing poking out of it. And in his left hand, he is holding perfectly still 3 balloons. There's a blue one, yellow in the middle, and a red one. They seemed to be glued together or something, from the way the wind did not move them around at all. Of course, I couldn't believe it and pulled out my phone and Snapchatted the blurry picture and posted it on my story, not saving it like a dumbass. If you have ever been drunk before, you know that your body doesn't want to do what you say. For whatever reason, my mind told me to approach this clown and tell him to get the hell out of our town. I'm drunk, wobbling a bit, and have no way to protect myself. Guys, do not be me. Do not try to be a hero. Go and get someone quickly. Go and run as far away as fucking possible. I sprinted as fast as I could toward the clown that was still standing perfectly still in the open space. I steadied myself on the back of the last car that was parked on the grass and leaned against it and hollered out, "Hey you, creepy bitch! What the fuck are you doing out here? Get lost!" The clown looked at me for a bit, and the lights from the club were the only thing providing light to this space. He stepped towards me a bit and smiled. My heart froze, and I could no longer hear a courageous voice in my head. His teeth were so yellow. Not yellow stained, but looked like they were made out of yellow enamel. He spoke in a voice that can only be described as someone who is groggy, just waking up from a nap.
You're so lucky you aren't what I'm looking for. You wouldn't fit in my car.
I started to take a few steps back. The ankle straps on my heels did a little to steady me, and the car I was leaning on seemed to be floating away with every beat my heart took. "What the fuck is that supposed to mean?" I snapped back. "You have no reason to be around here creeping on people and just being a fucking predator. Leave! I'll get the cops on you. I will." I just knew that he was going to leave. I stood straight up and flipped my hair back, knowing that he would turn and walk away. But I was wrong. Dead wrong. In the very next blink of my eye, his right hand was around my throat, pressing on it. His hand, though gloved, was very, very cold. He had been standing out there for a while. He pressed his lips against my ears and spoke.
Now listen, you little slut. If it wasn't for the fact that your body disgusts me, I would have had you in my trunk, and in 32 hours you'd be in pieces, scattered around this town. Be grateful I'll let you off with a warning. I am not one to be fucked with. There are many of us waiting for people like you, alone. We are stronger than you'll ever be. Many of us have refined taste, children, elderly, teens, college students. My taste, however, is short, skinny blondes and brunettes. And that's what I'm looking for, hunting for. So be lucky and take this warning. If you ever cross my path or my brothers ever again, we won't hesitate to kill you. I know plenty of brothers who love your kind. I'll be sure to tell them about you."
He let go of me and I fell to the ground, and embarrassingly peed myself. The stream of my urine seemed to go on forever as he stared down at me with eyes wide. I could see myself so clearly in the white of his eyes. He kicked my legs and stomped on my knee about 3 times before the doors to the club swung open behind me, and crowds of people came stumbling hurriedly out the double doors. I heard him say fuck under his breath and get into a black Toyota with blacked out tinted windows. It was actually hidden in the shadows where the lights of the club didn't touch. He had obviously stalked this place. He knew its weaknesses. I couldn't find it in me to move. I couldn't find it in me to speak. I looked down at the grass and couldn't find any other sensation in my body other than that of the racing of my heart. I couldn't tell you how many minutes had passed, but I pressed the panic button on my cousin's car keys, and to my greatest relief, the car was maybe 10 steps away. I used the bumper of the car I'd been leaning on to steady myself and quickly made it to my cousin's car, feeling more sober than I ever felt in my life. My cousin and her friends were there, drunk and angry that I wasn't anywhere to be found and that I didn't answer my phone. I told them a quick lie about how I accidentally peed myself and ran out so as not to be seen due to embarrassment. Well, at least it was partially true, and we got home safe as can be. This is just a warning to all of you guys. Stay safe and don't mess with those fucking clowns.
Number 1.
About 7 years ago, I went to Ghana, West Africa with my mum. She is Ghanaian and I am Black British, but we were visiting our homelands together. At the time, I was 14, but my childhood was not an easy one, so I was and still am as sharp as a bullet. My mum owns a small hotel business abroad, and she had hired her cousin to take care of the business when we weren't around. She took him out of a village that had no electricity or gas, and he had been the caretaker for my mum's business for as long as I can remember at the time. Now, I know that sounds very nice of my mum, but she can be a ruthless woman. She is the source of my greatest pain and my greatest love. She can be a little brutish and cold though, but she'll never let anyone fuck with her. She's gone through some shit in Ghana, and her journey to get to London illegally was quite the James Bond story. We found out that he had been stealing money from her, so that was the purpose of our flight. We surprised him at the hotel by just turning up randomly, and the next day, my mum sacked him, which means he would have to pack his things and go back to a very poor mud hut in his village. When this happened, I wasn't at the hotel. I was in the city centre in Accra, in a very populated market with my mum's friend. However, for some reason, as I was walking about, a sudden sense of terror washed all over me. I'm 21 years old now, and since I'm a people person, I'm good at reading people, and I follow my gut because of these things. Anyway, I told my mum's friend that we should go back to the hotel. I was on autopilot when my body just started moving on its own, and suddenly I was sprinting back to the hotel, and he kept telling me to wait as we ran. When I got there, the woman staying in the hotel was standing outside crying, and she looked at me and hissed very low, "Run, or he'll kill you." Both me and my mum's friend are like, what the fuck? When I arrived, the back entrance to the small hotel was wide open. I bolted into the corridor and found my cousin standing outside a locked room with a machete and a passport screaming at the top of his lungs. I immediately hid behind a counter so that he couldn't see me, and in my language he said,
I'll fucking cut you like a butcher with his meat. You and your daughter. This is my building now.
My mum's friend stares, freezes up, and then bolts out the door of the hotel. The way the hotel is set up, you can enter the main gate and take a left into the small car park, or just come through the car park, where you can see into the windows of one of some of the rooms. Because of the high rates of armed robbery in Ghana, loads of houses have iron railings around their windows to prohibit entry, and they also prohibit exits. I ran back outside and dragged a chair from nearby next to the window of the room that was locked, and I saw that my mum was crying behind the door, shaking. I have never seen her like that in my life. She saw me and she froze, and then vomited onto the floor. I mouthed to her that I'll rescue her, and she shook her head and told me to run. Anyway, my cousin rounded the corner. I screamed and ran the other way. He chased me, but there was some distance between us, so I managed to crawl under the huge car gates and tell my neighbours. They kind of already knew because my mum's friend who took me to the market had already told them. They then went and called the chief of the area, and in about 3 minutes, over 10 huge fucking men are following me and my mum's friend to the hotel. My mum is really kind when she wants to be, and had helped these guys out by bailing them out of poverty. They disarmed my uncle and beat the shit out of him. I then found out that he had been holding my mum's passport in an attempt to stop her from leaving the country. So my mum comes out of the room and she's really shaken up. My adrenaline crashes when she's in safe hands, and I'm shaking really badly. We hold a group meeting about my cousin with the close neighbourhood members in the hotel, but I sit outside because I'm too scared to sit indoors with my cousin. Then my mum calls me inside, but when I go in, my cousin is absurdly nice to me. But I kind of ignore him because I'm really scared. He makes me and my mum a mug of hot tea and chocolate as an apology for losing it earlier. The other neighbourhood members are drinking some tea too. I glance at my mum, who is blowing the top of the tea because it's really hot. Then I stare at my mug for some reason. Staring at that cup of hot chocolate made my blood run cold. I asked my mum who made the tea, and she says that my cousin did, and that she agreed not to fire him due to his circumstances. At the time, I chided myself for being paranoid, but I'm so glad I followed my gut. It's 2 p.m. and it's the dry season in Ghana. It's so hot that it would be stupid to drink hot chocolate at this time. The drink looks fine, but something seems off. Its colour is slightly grey. So I lean over to smell it, and it doesn't smell bad, but it smells chemically, like a strong mosquito repellent kind of smell. My mum can't smell it because she's been crying, so her nasal passage is all blocked. She picks up her mug to have a sip, and I tell her that mine smells weird. I give it to one of the elders of the neighbourhood to smell, and they agree that it smells quite sharp. She puts the cup back down before she can have a sip, and suddenly the cup's rim is black as fuck. When my mum asks my cousin what's in the cup, he doesn't even miss a beat. He doesn't hesitate to tell her that it's loaded with rat poisoning. We keep a bag of it behind the fridge just in case we have an infestation or something. At this point, my whole body feels like molten lava. I have never, and probably will never, feel that kind of blinding hot white rage in my life ever again. I remember launching myself at my cousin, who was over double my age. I remember digging my fingers into his eye sockets and sinking them hard as I could until I drew blood. I understand now why people can be blinded by anger. When I came conscious of my actions, I was being hugged tightly by a tall black hulky man and hyperventilating like crazy. My stomach was scratched, and the bruise on the side of my face was huge.